This is Jeannie Weiner. We are so pleased you all are here with us tonight, and we're glad to have this opportunity to thank you for your support for the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan. As you all know, this is an exciting time for our organization. We're pursuing a Museum of Jewish Michigan. Our knowledge production is better than ever, winning awards. Our membership is growing, our programming is getting better and better, and our audience is spread across 27 states, plus DC, Canada, and Israel. And as some folks like to say around Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, our star is rising. And now I'd like to turn to my good friend, who is known to most of you, but in his new role, you're going to be thrilled with JHSM, our new Director of Development, Michael Feldman.
Thank you, Jeannie. I have to tell all of you that I love history, and I especially love Jewish history. So combining those things, I am so excited for this new task I'm taking on. I think that it's so important what JHSM does for our community and for the state. So I look forward to working with Katie and the whole crew and all of you. If any of you have any ideas or suggestions about how we can not only raise funds, but can raise friends as well, please contact me and let me know. I'd now like to turn it over to Katie Cangany, the JHSM Executive Director. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am so pleased you all are here tonight, and I am so pleased we have this opportunity, sort of in person, to thank you all for your support of JHSM. And now it is my pleasure to introduce someone whose star is not only rising, but absolutely skyrocketing, and that's tonight's speaker, Judy Batalion. She's got a very impressive resume. She was born in Montreal. She grew up speaking English, French, Hebrew, and Yiddish. She received her bachelor's degree in the history of science from Harvard. She earned her PhD in art history from the University of London. She has worked as a museum curator and a university lecturer. Now she lives in in New York City. And she's the author of White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. And she speaks to us tonight about her truly spectacular, monumental achievement, her latest book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos, which has been optioned by Steven Spielberg. So very impressive indeed. Please join me in welcoming Judy Batalion.
Thank you so much.
So Judy, first I want to say what a privilege and a pleasure it is to be talking with you tonight. And I marvel at the achievement of your book. And you have done something that we also try to do at JHSM, which is to produce intensively archival scholarship that is also totally accessible to a non-academic audience. And that is not an easy task. And you made it look effortless. So mazel tov to you. It really is a monumental achievement.
Thank you so much. This is very kind, and thank you for having me. And I'm really delighted to be here with you this evening.
So Judy and I will spend the next few minutes talking about the book, and then we will open it up to Q&A. And since we are such an intimate group, instead of doing that in the chat feature, although you're welcome to submit questions that way, I thought it would be lovely for us to have a conversation. So we'll start that in a few minutes. But first, I have a few questions. And I'd like to begin with the book's origins. The Light of Days opens with this wonderful visual scene setting that you do. You're in the British Library, in the reading room. You're surrounded by stacks of musty books that you've called up. You're ready to embark on this research project. And all of a sudden, these remarkable stories just sort of begin to throw themselves at you. And so I wonder if you can tell us about how this research project and this book came to be.
Of course I can. And I should say that I was at the British Library researching something else, really. I mean, this book really happened by accident. And, you know, as some say, it was really a beshert. intended kind of connection. This began 14 years ago. I was living in London. It was 2007. And it was a time in my life where I was thinking a lot about my Jewish identity. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. But I was thinking about what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passes over generations. I am a very, very anxious person. And I was a time in my life where everything felt very dangerous to me. And I began to question, how much of this was due to my Holocaust heritage? How much had my family story shaped how I really perceived and reacted to everyday dangers? And it was that psychological question that I set off to explore. I decided I wanted to write a piece. This was going to be a performance piece. I was doing performing at the time, about Jewish women who confronted danger. And I wanted to have a historical kind of spine to it, a real person. And the first one I thought of, a Jewish woman who confronted danger, was Hannah Senesh, who probably most of you are familiar with. She's someone I had studied in 5th grade. And Hannah Senesh, for those who might not know or want a refresher, she was a Hungarian Jew who made Aliyah, moved to what was then Palestine in the 1930s. She was a poet. She was a lyricist, so you probably know her songs. But during World War II, she decided she wanted to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper, and she volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe. She was caught very early on in her mission, but legend had it she looked her executioner in the eye when they shot her. I always grew up with Hannah Senesh as an image of Jewish courage, a symbol, a hero figure. But back in 2007, when I started writing about this, I wanted to know more about Hannah Senesh. I didn't just want to know about the hero. I wanted to know the person. Like, who does that? What poet chooses to jump out of airplanes and fight the Nazis? What is her psychology? What motivates that kind of audacity? That's what I wanted to understand. So I wanted to find a nuanced biography on Hannah Senesh, not just the heroic narrative about her. And that's what led me to the British Library, looking for Hannah Senesh, looking for this ideas around the psychology of danger. And I looked up Hannah Senesh in the catalog. I ordered whatever books they had. There were not very many. So I just ordered them all. And one of the books that came back, you have to pick up your books there in a stack. That's how it used to work. And it was this unusual book. It was an old dusty book with yellowing pages and a blue fabric cover with gold embossed writing on the front. It was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But I always say even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I decided to look through. I was intrigued by this artifact, and I just started flipping through it, looking for Hannah Senesh. I can't find her. She's only in the last 5-10 pages. The rest of the book is 170 pages in small script Yiddish of stories by and about dozens and dozens of young Jewish women who fought the Nazis, and primarily from the ghettos in Poland, with chapter titles like Weapons, Ammunition, Partisan Combat. There was an ode to guns. And this just stopped me cold in the library. I mean, I'd never read anything like this. Was the last thing I expected in a musty old Yiddish book about women in the ghettos. I was stunned by these stories. I was stunned by the tone. All of it just surprised me. And that's how this began.
So as you will know, in the discipline of history, we talk a lot about silences. So, especially in the archives, certain kinds of sources are not collected. Certain kinds of historical actors are privileged, certain kinds of narratives are selected or recorded or not recorded. And so it's a fancy way of saying that it's often harder to find women and people of color and other marginalized peoples even represented in the archive. And yet here, the irony, it seems in this project is there were dozens of sources there And so I'm curious, I'm curious what you think about that sort of silencing, that, clearly they existed, in some cases they were published, and yet they have been sort of forgotten. So what do you make of, the items being in the British Library and other archives, but so underutilized as far as our knowledge of them goes?
This, and yes, you're correct. It wasn't just in the British Library. When I went out to really begin researching this book, I found these testimonies in archives all in Israel, in Poland, in the US, in Canada. Many were published with these small presses, but these stories just hadn't reached a general public or even a Jewish public in a way that they're so dramatic and so compelling. It doesn't make sense. So this became a huge question for me. On the one hand, what happened? What is the story of Jewish women in the underground in Poland? And on the other hand, what happened to this story? Why did I not know about this? It didn't make sense. And so at one point, I even told my editor, I think this should be the whole book, why I don't know this story. And she didn't let me do that, but she did let me keep in a section about this at the end of the book where I do address this in more detail. So to avoid talking about this for the next 6 hours, I will just condense it to say that there are different reasons why we didn't know this story, I think. Some of them are political, and they have to really do with how the history, the story, the narrative of the Holocaust has been politicized. Sometimes we see it now even in Poland, where there are laws about what is allowed to be told and not to be told. And this happened in other contexts too, and particularly in early state Israel. There were also questions of zeitgeist. We've been interested in different elements of the Holocaust over the decades. At some point, the interest was in, concentration camps, and then in spiritual resistance, and then and so we've been, and now more recently in women's experience. There are also, over time, we've been uncomfortable talking about different elements of the Holocaust. But I think a lot of it in this story has to do with a personal silencing. Many of these women, even the ones that told their story initially, they stopped telling it. Or they never told it in the first place. And some of that has to do with the fact that they weren't believed. Some of it has to do with them being accused. And I read about this countless times. They felt that there was this kind of myth that the pure souls had perished in the Holocaust, but those who survived, they did something to survive, something conniving, perhaps. They were collaborators. They had slept their way to safety. Many women felt I don't know if they were accused of, or they felt accused of having abandoned their parents to fight, to be part of an underground. They suffered from terrible survivor's guilt. They felt that one woman, she herself, her name Chasia Bielika, she's a formidable story. She was part of a group of 17, 18 young Jewish women in Bialystok who lived and worked outside the ghetto, pretending to be young Christian women. They smuggled weapons. They started an anti-fascist league. They did espionage missions for the Red Army. They helped liberate Bialystok. They brought weapons from anti-Nazi Germans and transported them to the forests. I mean, an incredibly dramatic story. But she felt that compared to her survivor peers who had been through Auschwitz, she had it easy. She hadn't suffered enough to merit telling her story. And so that also stopped her from telling it for a long time. And then some of it is that these women they were so young during the war. And when the war was over, the ones that I write about, they were doing this resistance work. They were maybe 20 years old. They had their lives ahead of them. They had no family. They had no home. They were refugees in countries they often didn't even know the language. And it was very important for many of them to start fresh. They felt a compulsion to have children, to sort of a duty to recreate the Jewish people, and they wanted to raise their children in a happy, normal environment. And so, again, they didn't tell their stories for a long time, as part of a way to cope and to continue surviving. So many of the stories that I did find in these archives were either from the 1945 period or much more recent. I hope that very long-winded answer somewhat answers your question, but there's more in the book that explains it in more detail.
So let's talk about definitions for a moment, if we can. As you know, Judy, one of the questions that Holocaust scholars wrestle with is what constitutes an act of resistance. And some, favor a broad umbrella of basically the sheer will of staying alive constitutes resistance. And others feel that definition is too narrow and too general, and it diminishes the really heroic acts of it, and it essentially equates resistance with resilience. So given all of that baggage, I'm curious to hear you talk about, how you define acts of resistance and how you came to that definition.
I mean, I was very aware about these sort of scholarly debates about what counts as resistance. Does an act of resistance have to be pre-planned? Does it have to be organized? Does it even have to be conscious? Is it part of a group? Is it an active attempt to defy a regime? Is it shooting someone in the head? Or can resistance be, I mean, the Nazis wanted all Jews dead. So simply staying alive is an act of resistance. Telling a joke to relieve fear can be an act of resistance. So I was very aware of these academic distinctions and discussions. And at the end of the day, for me, I try to present as broad a sample of resistance activity as I could in the book. So I tried to include women who ran soup kitchens and underground schools and underground printing presses. They would smuggle bulletins by braiding them in their hair. Women ran underground summer camps. They helped orphans. They helped clothe children and feed the poor. I tried to include that activity, and then also the activity on the other end of the spectrum, which is young Jewish women who blew up Nazi supply trains, who shot Gestapo men in the head, who were ghetto fighters during guerrilla fighters in ghetto uprisings, flinging Molotov cocktails and throwing them at tanks. I wanted to show that the broad array of activity that women engaged in. Many of the women that I speak about in the book had a particular role of courier girls. In Hebrew, they were called kashariot, connectors. And these were young Jewish women who performed. They pretended to be Christian women. And as such, they slipped in and out of ghettos. They did their work on the outside, on the Aryan side, performing this fake identity, and they connected the ghettos. They brought Jews information. Ghettos weren't allowed to have radios. They weren't allowed to have newspapers. It was often young Jewish women bringing the news of the death camps, the news of the genocide. Young Jewish women, these same women, they brought false papers, false passports, fake IDs, medication, money. And they also were the ones who often armed the ghetto undergrounds. It was these young Jewish women who snuck out and met with weapons dealers, met with people from the Polish resistance, met with different sources of weapons, hid them in fashionable handbags and in their pockets and taped to their torsos, and then brought them back into the ghettos to help arm them for their uprisings. They also did rescue work. And these were, again, they helped take Jews out of ghettos, out of labor camps, and find them hiding spots, sometimes in the cities, sometimes in the countryside. And they would then support their charges in hiding. They would pay off the hiders. They would come with money. They would come with medical help when needed. They would come with even just a book or a piece of paper and a pencil to give them something to do, some spiritual nourishment. So young women did all these roles, and I try to include as broad an array as possible.
talk to us a little bit about the Poland of the 1930s that these young Jewish women were coming of age in, because it seems to me that so much of the story you tell is rooted in their experiences in the years before they became, you know, radicalized resistors. So what is it about Poland in the 1930s that allowed them to really take on these roles?
I love that you asked that question, because I've become obsessed now with Poland in the 1930s. I'm actually, now I think I'm going to write something about that. So so Poland in the 1930s was a period that is, I think, so under discussed, so eclipsed by what happened after, but it was an amazing time for Jewish culture. That, you know, there were 180 Jewish newspapers in Warsaw. I mean, you know, it was it was a golden era. There was also growing anti-Semitism, but also film and theater and cabaret and political parties. And Poland was, and because I'm writing about women, there was, I don't want to say it was feminist. They wouldn't have used that term. It sounds anachronistic, but it was so much more progressive than I would have ever imagined. Women had the vote in 1918. It was before most Western countries. School was mandatory for boys and girls in the 30s through 8th grade. Jewish women in Western Europe, they were more bourgeois, generally slightly more wealthy, and women had more domestic roles. But in Poland, on the whole, they were a bit poorer. Women worked. In 1931, 45% of the Jewish labor force was women. Women actually got married later. They married in their late 20s, their early 30s. They had fewer children. They worked more. They had a public life. Universities were open to women. The majority of women in Polish universities were Jewish. And even fashion changed for women in Poland in the 30s. They wore, you know, their hair short, stuck back in barrettes, fitted blazers, shorter heels, skirts were raised. It was clothes that they could work in, that they could walk in, that they could run in. Amidst all this, there's another context going on, which is the youth movements. And because the women that I write about were very young. In Poland in the 1930s, Jewish youth was organized into youth movements. 100,000 young Jews were members of these youth movements. And these youth movements were political bodies. They were often affiliated with political parties or with political ideologies. They were value driven. They were like the Scouts, I always say, but more so. They were social, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual breeding grounds for young Jews. They used to, one of them used to joke that your last name was the name of your youth movement. I mean, it was like your whole world for these young Jews. And the movements that I write about were socialist, secular youth movements. Some were Zionist, some were not. But in these movements, they were, again, value driven. They really believed Jewish pride in our history, pride in our heritage. They were socialists. They believe in collaboration, collectivism. They read psychoanalysis and psychology. They talked about they were very self-aware. Sorry, there's sirens here now. It's like storms and protests and sirens. Okay, I think so. What was I saying? They were, they really talked about how they work together. They were very conscious about this. They talked about collaboration. They talked about group work. They also, again, women were leaders in these youth movements. They were egalitarian often. Women had leadership roles, and they believed very much in self-sufficiency. They worked the land. It was taking care of yourself, agency. That was very important. They were trained to be aware and to plot and to act. And I had no idea about this before doing this research. There were kibbutzim or communes all over Poland. And many of these young Jews left their family homes. Often the parents were very upset about this, and they would move in for periods of time with their comrades in these communes, in these kibbutzim all over Poland. And these groups really, they trusted each other. They knew each other very well. They had very strong leadership structures and collaborative structures and trust. And these were the groups that later on became the underground cells in the ghetto, the fighting units. And even though when they started, they were not meant at all to fight Nazis, they were social action, spiritual groups. They had the leadership, they were primed to become these guerrilla cells.
So, so the central, maybe this isn't entirely accurate, but one of the most important figures in your book is a woman named Rena, and the book opens and then closes with her. And I'm curious how you chose her as your sort of central figure, and what struck you about her and her story in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a few reasons. So first of all, going back to that Yiddish book I found in the British Library, that book had it was a collection of different bits, some obituaries, it was excerpts, memoirs, essays, journalistic bits. And one of them was in the middle. It was the longest bit, and it was by this woman, Rena. There was no last name even, just Rena. And her story immediately struck me. She wrote with a very matter-of-fact tone, even a wit. And her story was dramatic and detailed, and she told it as a narrative. And I say that because many of these other writers were very political. As I said, they were socialists. They wrote a lot from that political slant, and she didn't. She herself was not particularly political before the war. And she wrote in a way that struck me as being extremely modern, very contemporary, and she felt very relatable because she wasn't a bleeding heart socialist she actually felt more like any woman we could relate to now. And that drew me into her story. Do you want me to show you a photo of her as I speak? Let's see if this works. Oh, I'm on the wrong page, but here she is. This is Rena. This was taken in 1944. And she had actually, I don't want to give too much away, but she had left Poland at this point. This was in Budapest, right before the Nazis came in. She was still pretending to be Christian on the street. Rena was young when the war started. She was about 14, just turning 15 when Hitler invaded. She was defiant from the start. She would sneak out of the ghetto and trade family heirlooms for food to help feed her family. She knew she was going to be killed. And in the summer of 1942, her whole family decided they were going to escape the ghetto, and they were all going to go in different directions. And she went by herself, and she fled through fields. She pretended she looked good. She could pass as a Catholic Pole. She pretended to be Christian. She got a job working as a housemaid for a German family. But she really wanted to connect with her sister, and she found a way to connect with her sister. Her sister smuggled her over to this town of Bijin in southwest Poland, where she was. Her sister was in the underground. When Rena arrived, she was 18 years old, and they needed someone to work as a courier, to go back to Warsaw and gather supplies, information, and weapons for their revolution that they were planning in Bijin, for their rebellion. All their other couriers had been killed. And because she looked good, they asked if she would go. And she said, of course I'll go. And for the next, over 1943, for about a 6-month period, she went back and forth between Warsaw and Bijin, buying weapons, smuggling weapons, papers, money, organizing rescue plans, and helping to smuggle people.
That collection of photographs that you have at the end of your book is really powerful, and it shows some of the women in their passing personas. It shows some of the training grounds and the youth movements that you were talking about earlier. And I'm curious, as you came upon these photographs in the course of your research before you put them together in the book, what struck you about them as you were looking at these women that you had been researching and trying to reconstruct?
Well, I mean, I love doing this photo research. I loved when I found the photographs, and I didn't find the photographs until much later in my work. But what struck me, and I can just show you a few, is these women look so modern. They look so relatable to me. The second woman on the right here with the amazing fur collar, that's Frumka Plotnicka. This is taken in Bialystok in 1938. She was already a leader in the youth movements. This was her youth movement group. And she fled out of Poland as soon as Hitler arrived, as the whole movement went east, but she couldn't take having fled. She smuggled herself back into Nazi-occupied Poland. She went back to Warsaw. She became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. They called her Die Mame, the mother. And she traveled the country pretending to be Christian, but she would go into ghettos, giving lectures, giving seminars. She was one of the first people to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. She brought 2 guns in a sack of potatoes. She later ended up in the town of Bijin, where she ran the underground and their final uprising. But you asked about the photos. I can talk so much, as you can see, about all of these. I hope I'm answering questions as we go. This is what, can I tell you about this photo? Do we have time, or have I gone off track already?
No, do it.
Okay, this photo is such a good story. This is one of my favorites. So the woman in the middle here on the bottom, her name is Bella Khazan. Bella was, again, part of the underground from the get-go. She wasn't blonde, but she looked a little lighter. She was passable. She was a bit, medium height. But they said to her, they sent her to live on the outside, on the Aryan side. So they sent her to a town of Grodno. In Grodno, she rented a room. She was living 24/7 as a Catholic Pole. She was, before they used to call it an acting job with no intermission. And she had to get a day job, both to support herself and because it would look very suspect if she didn't have a job. So she went to the local town employment office and interviewed for a job. And they said, "Oh, we have the perfect job for you. What is it? Oh, you'll work at the Gestapo." So she got a job working in the Gestapo headquarters in Grodno. She was a translator and receptionist. She brought them tea. She's basically a secretary in the Gestapo office. She also stole their documents, and she would take, passports, travel papers, their stamps, and she would bring them to the underground Jewish forgery lab so they could copy them and make fake papers, both for the underground and for Jews in general. One of the men in the Gestapo office, a Gestapo man, took a liking to her. He had a crush on her. And in 1941, he invited her to the Christmas party, the Gestapo Christmas party. And again, she couldn't say no. Anything that seemed odd, seemed off, brought attention, you couldn't do it. So of course, she had to smile and say, "Of course I'll come to the party." Turned out that night, these other 2 couriers, Lanka Kajabrodska on the right and Tema Schneiderman on the left, were staying in her apartment in Grodno on their own missions, transporting weapons across the country. And what was she going to do with them? And there was also a whole pretense that they were cousins, and they were saying, so she said, "Come with me." So all 3 Jewish girls in the underground pretended to be Christian and went to this Gestapo Christmas party in Grodno in 1941. And this photograph was taken at the party. It was part of the festivity to have a photographer there. This photograph actually ends up getting her caught later on, but you have to read the book. I can't give away everything. But that's, the photo research, it's both the look of these women, the personalities, the psychologies, and then the story, and they're modern, but then also the story around the photography itself is always, it's just been fascinating.
I want to ask one more question, then we'll open it up to Q&A. Tell us about the title. How did you settle on The Light of Days?
So there are a few reasons for this title. This was a hard book to find a title for many, many years. In my computer, I'll tell you a secret, it was called Ghetto Girls. It was not called The Light of Days. But then Girls was overused at that time, and I couldn't use that. Every title I threw out that was rejected and rejected and rejected. I didn't know what to do. And my editor and I had a conversation, and we decided, let's look at poetry. let's look at songs. I didn't even know of what, of Holocaust songs, of women, Jewish right. We weren't even sure. I was looking at Chana Senish. And then I remembered that in that original Yiddish book, there were some poems. And as part of this collection of materials, so I went back to that, and there was this one poem with a stanza, and this was actually written by a young Jewish woman in the Warsaw Ghetto as part of a songwriting competition. There were many arts competitions in the ghettos, and this won. And one of the stanzas was saying, Warsaw right now is decimated, but we know one day it will again see the light of day. And that felt bittersweet. There was an inspirational element to that, and the fact that it was written by a young woman, it all sort of fit. But also there are other reasons, because I always have very long answers to all the questions. So around that time when we were trying to decide the title, I happened to be reading certain passages in some of these testimonies, and many of these women, they were very hungry. They were very thirsty, which was it's actually very difficult to read about, but they're writing around this. But the other thing that they really craved, they were in the underground, and many of them for long periods of time were underground. And something that came up again and again was they craved the light of day. They craved sunlight, the ability to go outside and be under the sun. And I found that very moving in a way. And it felt like matching those two reasons up felt right, so.
All right, let's open up the floor for more conversation. If you've got a question, if you just give a hand, or you can do it electronically, and I will call on folks as I see hands if you've got things. Or I can keep going. I have a million questions, but let's give you all a chance if you'd like to weigh in. Susie.
Did you establish a relationship with the children of any of these women?
Yeah, I met with about 20 families and interviewed them about their mothers or their grandmothers. And when I did interview them, I didn't talk to them generally about their experience in the war. I was very interested in hearing from the families about who, of course, for women who survived, who they became. I was so interested not only in how they survived the war, but how they continued surviving. Who were they? What did they like to do? What was their favorite thing to cook? Their favorite place to travel? Were they funny? Were they serious? Did they have friends? Were they very private? I wanted to understand who they were after the war, how they continued to be after what they had been through. And then this also helped me color in their characters previously too. I got to understand them and know them in a better way, in a more robust kind of way.
Other questions? Harriet? Harriet, would you mind unmuting? Okay.
Sorry. First of all, I just want to thank you for writing the book. And as far as I'm gone, it has been powerful that I've almost had to stop. Part of it in reading it is I can't read it continuously because I get so overwhelmed with not only the wonder of what these women did, but could I ever have been that kind of person? Could I have taken that dangerous time and place on? And just a sec. And I'm just curious what you found, two things, what you found the most difficult to look at and research, and perhaps what, to balance that out after we talk about the difficulty, the aspect, give us one example of one positive, really surprising thing that you found about any one of the women that might be interesting to us. So that's kind of two halves of a question, the difficulty and, one kind of surprise.
All right, so 1A, the difficulty. This was very difficult to research. This was difficult emotionally. This was difficult intellectually to put together this history. And this was difficult logistically. I was working with so many languages with, people that have been shot out through the world, archives in different countries. I'm gonna answer your question actually. I'm gonna take it a slightly different way and talk about some of these logistics and how difficult it was. These women had so many names. I told you before when I was talking, in Rena's original book, she didn't even have a last name. I had to track down who this person even was. And the reason she hadn't used a last name was for security reasons. That was written in 44. No one wanted to put a last name. It was still during the war. So these women had Hebrew names, Yiddish names, Polish names, like 35 nicknames. Then during the war, they often took on these Christian identities. They had fake papers, fake passports. They got new names. They went by those names, these nom de guerres. Then even for those that survived, when they were trying to leave the country, it was easier if they were married. So they had these fake marriages. They changed their names. Then they moved to new countries where they changed their names to fit in, to sound American or to sound Israeli, to sound Hebrew. Their Polish names were very difficult. And then they actually got married and most of them changed their names. So there was in particular for women, they changed their names so many times. And that made the work very complicated on a very almost basic detective-like level. You know, I spend days, is Astrid the same as Esterit, the same as Esther, the same as Rena would just wrote the same, for security reasons, is that the same, you know, was it the same person? And it took me a lot of time to even understand that, that was the same. And, you know, and of course I'm working in Latin letters, in English alphabet. So it was very complicated. The main region where a lot of the activity in the book takes place is an area of Poland. And even now, I will still pronounce it incorrectly. It's something like Zagłębie. And that's the Yiddishy, Polishy, Zagłębie. And there were times where I had to find books. They were called like, you know, and one of them was like, you know, the murder in Zagłębie in Yiddish. But I had to find these in English. How do you spell Zagłębie? And there was one day I was at the Center for Jewish History near Union Square in New York. I had like 4 librarians and me, and they're amazing there. We were like, Zaglile. I mean, these are not, you know, there were the town names, the people names, the Slavic. It was really, we found it. One man realized you could have a Y and then an I. That was like a common thing. Anyways, these were, you know, they're very literal complications, but it did make the work hard. Of course, alongside the emotional difficulty of the work and just figuring out what happened. So yes, I kind of took that in a different direction, but I hope that answered your question a little bit.
What about the surprising part, Judy? What surprised you the most?
I mean, this was the kind of project where everything surprised me. Like every day I'd call my husband, like, can you believe that there, you know? And he'd be like, I'm working. So many things surprised me. I mean, these stories like Bella working in the Gestapo headquarters, but I was surprised by the sheer size of the Jewish underground. I had no idea. I'd heard of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I didn't know what had happened. And I had no idea that over 90 European ghettos had armed Jewish underground units. There were revolts in towns across Poland. There were revolts, I write about one at Auschwitz, you know, in Sobibor, Treblinka. There were at labor camps. There were many, there were just so many uprisings. And, I think that like many people, even though my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, I too had absorb this myth of Jewish passivity. It's part of why this book stunned me out of that. Here's all these stories about Jewish women, active, moving, you know, crawling over ghetto walls and jumping off trains and smuggling guns. And I think that I just came out of this project seeing the Holocaust, certainly in Poland, where I've been working all these years, as, you know, a story of constant resistance, constant resilience, constant defiance, constant struggle. Most people were killed because they were up against a brutal, sadistic military force. But this was not a story in any way of passivity. It was a story of so much activity and fury and passion and movement and life. I think we may have lost our host. Does anyone have another question?
Yeah, I do, Judy. This is Jeannie. First of all, you are amazing to listen to, and I'm so glad that we had this opportunity. I know that your book, everybody's talking about it, and many people that I wouldn't have expected to read it have read it. And I wonder if you could talk about two different aspects of reaction to the book. One, in Poland, what has been, if you know, the reaction, and is there any memorializing or remembering of these women in any way in Poland? And also, we are so much in the throes of anti-Semitism right now, and people are talking about anti-Semitism and again and more, and it's a subject that's being brought up over and over. And so I just wonder what kinds of reactions you're getting to the book from both Poland and from people that are coming to you, perhaps other survivors or whatever.
Okay, so this is like a 10-hour answer. As you could tell, I lost it. So I'm just trying to think about how to summarize that in a few minutes. So let's start with Poland. The book is coming out in Poland next year in Polish. So it hasn't been published in Polish yet, but there has been reaction in Poland to the English version of the book. And as I've always felt with Poland, it has been absolutely bifurcated. I've gotten the two sides. I've had journalists in Poland write about how could we not have more monument? How one of them said we should start a campaign for a monument to Nusha Teitelbaum. She was a Jewish woman I wrote about she was from the Communist Party. She had a degree in history from Warsaw University. She would dress up as a Polish peasant girl, play all naive, walk into a Gestapo man's office or home and shoot them in the head. I mean, she was a true, one story, she pretends she's pregnant. She wants to go see her boyfriend. She goes to the Gestapo headquarters, just shoots them and then leaves and, I mean, incredible character and person. And she was killed in the war. She was called Little Wanda with the braids. That's how the Gestapo referred to her. She was on all their wanted lists. Sorry, I got a... I talk too much. So, there were journalists writing that we must in Poland now create monuments to this. This is incredible. There was an article written about me that this was from the other side, that I am a liar, that I'm part of the problem, a group of liars who tell these lies about the Holocaust. None of this ever happened. And instead of writing about this, I should write about the real story, which is that the Gestapo was Jewish and was collaborated with Jews. And there was a lot of traction on that side too, which was actually very frightening for me. This was all on Twitter, and I'd never experienced anything like that. So there was the Holocaust denier side, and then there was the really supportive and interested in our collective history side. So I've had both reactions. Okay, your next question was about anti-Semitism. Oh, you're muted.
There. I really wanted to know what kind of reaction you're getting from survivor families or survivors, or is there anything being said about the heightened anti-Semitism in the world now and how this book plays a role in it?
That in itself, I think, is two questions. I've been contacted by many survivor families, survivors, families with people who didn't survive, but who asked me, I know my great aunt was in the underground. She was on a bus transporting dynamite. She was killed. Do you know anything about her? Or here, let me tell you this story about my mother's friend in Bialystok and what she did. I was just saying before, I had lunch today with a 93-year-old Holocaust survivor who contacted me after reading my book. He cooked me lunch and wanted to tell me his story. He was an incredible person, an incredible story. He pretended to be non-Jewish. As a man, was much harder because men were circumcised and women didn't have that. And he joined the Polish underground as a Pole, pretending to be Catholic, and did work with the Polish underground. So I've had an outpouring of stories. I've met with people, I've met with families. I found out many of the people I wrote about, they didn't even know that these were their relatives. And, Rena, who's the central character, this also happened this week. She has a whole branch of the family in the US. They didn't know about their family in Israel. I made a shidduch between these families. It turns out they're cousins from the same family. And they had a family Zoom this week. They wanted me to join. They all reunited. They didn't even know about each other. So there's been some, yes, I've gotten very involved in some families and some people's lives. So generally the response from survivors and survivors' families has been grateful and engaged, and we've just been starting conversations. The question of anti-Semitism, part 3 of your question, a lot of people ask about this, and I don't. This is a history book. I try to think about what can we learn from it? What can I learn from it? And I think what I learned from this story is, first of all, these underground groups were very organized. It wasn't just a person here doing that or a person doing that. They came from these youth movement groups. They had very strong structures, social structures, leadership structures. They knew how to talk to each other. They knew how to work together. And especially in the ghettos, where the different groups managed to overcome their differences, and I mean Jewish groups, and work together, there was even a greater underground response. So, I think that there's, it really feels like the need for some communal language and discussion and collaboration across organizations, even of different ilks, and a kind of bipartisanship that was that when it worked, in certain towns like Vilna, they all worked together and they had a really strong underground there. So I've thought about that, the need to communicate and collaborate and organize. And the other thing I think about these young fighters was they knew they weren't going to topple the Nazis. They knew they weren't going out there to erase the German army or erase anti-Semitism. They knew, they used to joke that their whole weapons cache fit into a basket on a bicycle. That didn't matter. What mattered were the small acts, the things they could accomplish, the things they could plan and plot and do and carry out and set their minds to. And these small activities, saving one person, shooting blocking a transport, like delaying a liquidation by a week. They focused on tangible acts, and these small acts saved people. They helped people. They were meaningful to them. They're meaningful to the people around them. They're meaningful to us generations later. So I think I take that as some kind of lesson as well.
So Jeannie, since I cannot see any hands raised, would you mind moderating since I'm on my phone?
There is one hand raised. Michael is right.
Oh, someone's muted.
Okay.
Michael, yeah, there.
So my question is, did you get any answers to your original question about how your Holocaust background shaped your life?
Well, I never really get answers, maybe more questions. But I think what I learned here is that yes, I think when I went into this project, I was thinking about the pathology. I was thinking about trauma and the troubles it caused and the difficulty and how the trauma and the pain passed over generations. And I think what I've come out of this project thinking about is how also the strength passed through generations and the passion and the fight and the fury and the compassion and the courage. And, you know, my Bobby, yes, she passed on trauma. She's also the strongest person I know. And I'm trying to hold those both together, that all of that, I think, passes to us and through us.
So Katie, I think we can wrap up. I don't see any other questions.
Well, please join me in thanking Judy Batalion for this marvelous discussion. Thank you, Judy. This was sensational. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for your very thoughtful questions. Multi-part questions, but very thoughtful and engaging questions. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you all for coming. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.